It's only the third state visit to the US by an Indian leader, and only the third state dinner being hosted by President Biden for a world leader. There's so much excitement over it. How do you see this visit?
Well, visits are largely symbolic. The real work is done before and after. So the visit represents closer US ties, and they began actually in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in recent years, they have accelerated for obvious reasons. Most of the investment coming into Indian startups is American venture capital money. At the time of quantitative easing, low interest rates, American money flocked here for high returns. So economics is a big driver. Second, of course, is the obvious factor, the China factor. India tried very hard to have good relations with both China and the US, but China has been aggressive vis-a-vis India, and China has tried to tie India down in the Indian subcontinent through a string of pearls. So in a way, India had no option but to lean a bit further towards the US, and the US obviously has its own geopolitical imperative to back India as fundamentally a counterweight to China. And then, of course, there is allied democratic values, even though there are elements in the US administration who complain, and of course in Capitol Hill and in American media, who complain a lot about Indian democracy. But still, India is not a communist-run, Xi Jinping-led China. So at the end of the day, the Americans are betting big on India for multiple reasons, and India has its own reasons to deepen relations with the US.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. If President Bill Clinton's visit to India in 2000 marked a new era in this bilateral relationship, and the civil nuclear deal inked under President Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh took it to a new level, is Prime Minister Modi's state visit to the US in 2023 in a sense a coming of age of this relationship?
Well, that is certainly it's certainly going to be seen as a coming of age because of the agreements in defense cooperation, because of the star billing of the Prime Minister, because there is now a more robust rhetoric. You look at The Economist. The Economist had a full cover issue about Modi's visit. And so certainly it is a coming of age, but having said that, I always say that the real work happens before and after. So the visit is great, and it's a phenomenal marker, phenomenal milestone, but expect a lot more ahead.
All right. I'm going to ask you this. When Prime Minister Modi attended the Howdy Modi event in Houston in 2019, he said, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar." He drew a loud applause from the Indian diaspora, but some had expressed a concern that if a Democrat became US president next, this could cause some awkwardness for India. And lo and behold, it's a Democratic president who's hosting a state dinner for Prime Minister Modi. Clearly, there's a lot of bipartisan support for this bilateral relationship. You'd agree?
That's certainly the case. And remember that Joe Biden is an experienced hand in foreign policy. He has an experienced foreign policy team. They are moderates. They're realists. They are not ideologues, for instance, like Neha Khanna, the congressman from California, and many others. And so they are not the crazy woke left of the Democratic Party. So they have let bygones be bygones. Obviously, they didn't like Ab ki baar Trump sarkar. That was certainly not something that Joe Biden's campaign enjoyed, and I'm sure the Modi campaign wouldn't enjoy if Joe Biden came and said Ab ki baar Rahul sarkar. So certainly that happened. That's water under the bridge or over the dam, and now as grown-ups, they have moved on. So it's not ironic. It's fundamentally a reflection of the new reality of India. India is a growing economy. India will soon have more investment opportunities than, and it already has more investment opportunities than any comparable economy. Europe is aging. Europe has a debt problem. The US is, of course, extraordinarily technologically savvy, particularly when it comes to defense, when it comes to Chat GPT, artificial intelligence, when it comes to things like Tesla, SpaceX, Apple, Google, Amazon, you name it. These are all very powerful companies. But the US cannot take the burden of global growth alone. The US cannot necessarily consume all the goods and services its companies produce. So India is a very valuable market. And as I said, India now has greater geopolitical heft too. So the US has bet big, and it's not just Joe Biden. I mean, you can see that all across the administration. For instance, I have been supremely impressed by Admiral Mike Baker, the US Defense Attaché to India. I mean, he is a top man, and you can see the amount of work he has put in. And so many people like him in different arms of the US government, they have put in. It shows that the US is now certainly betting big on India.
It does look like that. I want to focus a little bit on the American media. Now, Prime Minister Modi has visited the US many times in the past, and of course, the state visit has great import, unlike any other. But do you see a clear change in the kind of coverage that this visit is garnering in the American media compared to past visits? The Wall Street Journal carried the Prime Minister's interview on page 1, for example.
Well, there's certainly a shift, but I wouldn't count on the shift staying for too long, because remember, the people who work in American media, particularly, not all of them, particularly the big names, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, NPR, and even the Wall Street Journal, they are largely anglicized elites. They are upper caste, upper class elites. And for a lot of them, the fact that you have somebody from a small town, the fact that you have people of the vernacular now in power, meaning Gujarati speakers or Hindi speakers, it's fundamentally difficult for them to take. So they're reflecting fundamentally their class prejudice and, of course, their ideological bias. A lot of them are left-leaning. And if you dig deeper and you see the families they come from, in India, people who were more affluent studied humanities. In particular, they were the ones who early on sent their children to study at Yale or Harvard or whatever. So you look at the sorts of people who populate these publications. They're invariably people who, come from such families, and their loyalties, therefore, are to the previous government, which dispensed patronage. So obviously, there's a natural bias there. Then, of course, the Americans who come out of Ivy Leagues, they are inclined to the left, and they view the BJP through a very ideological lens. Now, I'm not holding a candle for BJP. The BJP has its issues. We are not here to discuss that. What we are here to say is that much of the rhetoric has been overblown, whether it was the use of Hindu fascism. Fascism, by the way, is an Italian political philosophy. It has very little to do with Indian social conditions. Then, of course, the use of the term Hindu supremacism, which is analogous to white supremacism. So a lot of this, probably conscious or unconscious, but it's certainly bias. And some of that bias has diminished. And note that it has diminished in the paper that covers business, the Wall Street Journal. I'd expect Bloomberg also to be similarly more positive on India. But if you look at the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, NPR, I would expect them to have more of a bias, continued bias, until, of course, the BJP government is replaced by a left-leaning government. That's just the nature of the beast.
Very interesting. So you see a distinct class and ideological bias in the coverage of the Indian government and its Prime Minister by most of these media houses in the US. Okay, please go ahead.
So, look at who works in Washington Post. Ishan Tharoor. His father is Shashi Tharoor. So, look at the sorts of people. And they have, obviously, vested interests. So it isn't as if they are objective. Now, there are problems, by the way, with all political parties in India, all of them. And they have different sets of issues. And there are problems both with the Republicans and with the Democrats. You know, the Democrats often call the Republicans basically racist fascists. And the Republicans now call the Democrats, I mean the extreme wings of both parties, not everyone, call them basically totalitarian, woke totalitarians. So you've got a division, a very deep division within the US. There's a chasm which is very deep and very wide. And often the people who tend to fall on the left today in the US project the internal divide on external parties as well. So there are many factors that make the understanding of a foreign country difficult in the US. And remember, the US is an ideological country. So people tend to view the world through ideological prisms. So they don't have such a good handle on history or context. The current Democratic administration is largely an exception because it's run by seasoned hands. But were power to slip into the more ideological types, then of course things could be slightly different.
Okay, that is certainly a very interesting take on the American media's coverage of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP government. But I want to shift our focus now to another issue. We've seen the kind of rock star reception Prime Minister Modi receives from the Indian diaspora whenever he travels abroad. We've not seen that in case of any other world leader. In fact, President Biden joked with Prime Minister Modi when they met at the G7 summit in Hiroshima recently about this. He said, "You're creating a real problem for me. I'm getting so many calls for invites to the White House state dinner. Everyone wants to be there. You're very popular." What explains this aura and the wild popularity of Prime Minister Modi with the Indian community abroad?
Well, first of all, I think President Biden, Joe Biden, is playing the old trick of flattering your guest. I mean, he's a seasoned operator, so it's helpful for him to negotiate whatever he's trying to negotiate if he flatters his guest. So I would take whatever he says with a pinch of salt. Now, having said that, of course, the Prime Minister is popular with the diaspora. Remember, a lot of people who left India because they wanted India to have better economic growth. They wanted India to be more entrepreneurial. They left India because they were tired, in particular, of the bureaucracy. People like me left because everything, when I was younger, seemed to be run by the IAS, whether it was the Central Board of Secondary Education or the Textile Ministry or the Finance Ministry. So if you really were entrepreneurial, if you had expertise, you would always be polishing shoes and cleaning tabletops of the heaven-born bureaucracy. Now, what the diaspora that left and has achieved a lot, and remember, a lot of them are Gujarati, so there is the son of the soil pride as well. And of course, there are others too. It's not just them. So there is this feeling that he's a self-made chap. He's not a member of the Lucky Sperm Club. And a lot of them were upset by the Lucky Sperm Club members who dominated not just politics, but also Bollywood and other things. So his humble roots really resonate with immigrants who worked very hard and made it. So that's one. Two, his focus on delivering on infrastructure and economic growth, or at least his message, that resonates. Number three, what they really like in India after a long time, and mind you, a lot of the Indian Americans vote Democrat, so they are not exactly left or right. It's, a lot of them are accused of being people of the right, and some certainly are, but a lot of people who vote Democrat, end up supporting Modi. And the reason they do that is because they think the first time, after a long time, you have a focus on basic services. So let's talk about basic services: toilets, drinking water, gas cylinders, roads, ports. So it is this focus on basics, the stuff that affects the lives of hundreds of millions, that people who live in the US appreciate, because they often would go back home and be perturbed by the dismal state of India's infrastructure. And now when they come back home, certain things are world class. The India Stack, the digital payment structure, many other things that India did, such as the vaccination program, which was well done. All of these things have increased a certain level of pride. And there's a feeling that India is finally making progress, and that explains his popularity.
Okay. Certainly, a whole host of factors there that make him so popular, especially with the Indian diaspora. Now, a touch of personal warmth is being extended to Prime Minister Modi during this visit. President Biden and the First Lady will host the Prime Minister at a private event at the White House before the state dinner. President Biden is also likely to accompany the Prime Minister to a tech event. Over the years, we've seen a growing personal rapport between the two leaders, including some warm hugs. What do you make of the bonhomie and personal chemistry between the two leaders, and how important do you think it is during summits like these?
It's of some importance. I don't give it too much importance. I think interests are what define countries. And I've had many conversations with US diplomats and US officials, and we said, look, as long as our interests align, we can ignore certain things. For instance, if the US publishes, the State Department publishes an adverse report about religious freedom in India, well, India will shrug, because India knows that as far as the Pentagon is concerned, and as far as American investment is concerned, things are going on. Similarly, America will ignore India buying cheap Russian oil, because after all, we need that oil to control inflation. So going back to the two leaders, I am not someone who really personalizes foreign relations. The two chaps are likely to get along for a very simple reason. Biden is Irish, he's warm, he's gregarious, he's talkative. And of course, our Prime Minister, being a good Indian, is a warm chap and hugs people. And the Indian-Irish connection has gone back to Annie Besant, who began the Home Rule movement back to 1916. So we are certainly going to see personal warmth and bonhomie. But remember, there is a very strong institutional basis in the US. They have the State Department, they have the CIA, they have the Pentagon, they have the Army, they have the Navy, they have the Air Force, they have the Marine Corps. I mean, they've got strong institutions, and ultimately what drives relations between two countries are interests, and interests.
Okay, let's not personalize foreign relations. It's all about national interest. Fair enough. Final question, but I would request you to give us a quick response because we're out of time. The two leaders have to face an election next year in their respective countries. Is that likely to be a factor at all during this visit?
I suppose, yes, for the Indian side. For the Americans, many of them couldn't place India on the map. Many in Indiana couldn't place India on the map. So for the American president, this is not so much about elections in 2024. For our Prime Minister, of course it is. And let's see what happens next year in both countries.
Well, it certainly will be a fascinating election, both in India and the United States. For now, all eyes on this historic state visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the United States. Atul Singh, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time and perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much.